Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's Global Reading Network webinar on the Align process. My name is Carrie Stout, and I'll be one of your facilitators for today's webinar, and I look forward very much to your participation. I want to acknowledge all the various organizations and country contexts that are represented here today by your attendance. We've got a lot of people in Nigeria, Arizona, Guatemala, Ohio. I think I saw Cape Cod, so we're excited to have you all here today. In addition to being your facilitator today, I am also the International Project Coordinator for the Global Reading Network. Thank you for joining. I'm going to pass it to my colleague, Kathleen Denny, to review the agenda and to introduce you to the Align process. Over to you, Kathleen.
Thanks, Carrie. Hi, everyone. My name is Kathleen Denny. I'm the Align Specialist working with EDC's Leading Through Learning Global Platform. I'm going to go ahead and get us started by going over the agenda for today. So in just a few moments, I'm going to start with an introduction to the Align process, and I'll kind of give an overview of what Align is, why it was created, the different benefits of Align, and then also talk a little bit about how to prepare for an Align and the different resources and technical expertise that are needed to facilitate the Align. And then I'm going to hand it over to Nathalie Louge from FHI 360, and she's going to share her experiences using Align in Djibouti. And then I'll jump back in and kind of give you guys a tour of some of the new Align tools that we've been working to create over the last couple months, and also introduce the new Align Help Desk, which just launched a few moments ago this morning. So we're really excited to share that. And then we'll close out the presentation with a Q&A. So if you have any questions that pop up throughout the presentation, I would encourage you to write them down and then save them for that point in the webinar, and we'll answer anything that comes up at that point. So with that being said, we'll go ahead and jump into the actual presentation and talk about what is Align. All right, so Align is one of the most perfect acronyms. It stands for Aligning Learning Inputs to Global Norms. And essentially, Align is an evidence-based gap analysis tool that education systems can use to kind of determine whether the different pedagogical inputs that they have, like curriculum, teaching and learning materials, etc., to see how closely they align with the Global Proficiency Framework, and therefore how best they, or how they are able to kind of prepare learners to meet global norms in reading and math. So I mentioned the Global Proficiency Framework, and some of you, I'm sure, are familiar with what the GPF is. But for those of you who've not heard of it or maybe need a refresher, the GPF is a set of global standards for reading and math instruction for grades 1 to 9. And these standards represent the minimum proficiency that learners need to know in order to demonstrate mastery of basic skills in reading and math. And these standards were developed by a team of experts that were convened by UNESCO in 2018. And the standards are were developed based on research and reading and math instruction, but they were also kind of taken from a survey of trends identified in national assessments and also national curricula around the world. So one thing that is really good to know about the GPF is that these standards are applicable to any country or language of instruction. And this is kind of the thing that enables the GPF to provide this common lens for us to use in order to compare and disaggregate data that's reported through the SDG 4.1.1, Sustainable Development Goal 4.1.1. So that's everything about the GPF. And once again, the GPF is the main reference for the Align process. So that's kind of why we wanted to make sure everyone is familiar with the GPF. And Haley is actually going to share a link to the GPF and where it is hosted on EduLinks. So if you have not looked at it before, you can kind of take a moment to click on the link and see what all is included in the GPF and the resources. There are several different translations available, and there will be more, I think, in the coming months. So yeah, go ahead and take a look for a couple of seconds, and then we'll jump into the next topic. right, so now we're going to talk about why was Align created? So first and foremost, Align was created to utilize the GPF's potential beyond policy linking. And for those of you that might be new to policy linking is a method used to link international, national, and subnational assessments to the GPF. And the purpose of policy linking is basically to make sure that assessment results collected through SDG 4.1.1 reporting can be compared and aggregated globally. So basically, the Align process was created to almost as like the precursor for policy linking. So the assessment component of Align is used to determine if a country should complete policy linking by providing decision makers with kind of a clear understanding of the different adaptations and modifications that they need to do in order for countries to use their national assessment for international reporting. So once different stakeholders started using the Align process for assessments, they started to realize, well, we can use this for other things outside of assessment. We could also use this to look at curriculum, can look at teaching and learning materials, and also teacher trainings to see how well those different education inputs prepare students not only for the assessments, but also for minimum proficiencies as outlined by the GPF. So that's kind of why the Align process was created. And the current process that we have today is kind of based off of that kind of inspiration. And then there are several other reasons for why it was created that are on the PowerPoint. And I'm going to go ahead and jump forward just in the interest of time. All right, so there are 4 components of Align. As I I didn't mention this yet. So the 4 components of Align are curriculum, teaching and learning materials, teacher training, and assessment. And countries can prioritize any of the components based on kind of what is most relevant to their needs, to political will and buy-in, to resources that are available, time, etc. So a country could potentially do all 4 components of the Align in the Align process, or they could also do it more ad hoc and pick which component is most helpful in the moment. So for instance, if a country is ready to do a big curriculum overhaul, maybe they haven't looked at their curriculum in the past 20 years, the Align process for curriculum could be a perfect way to start that whole endeavor. Now, with that being said, even though it can be done kind of in an ad hoc manner, there is a natural hierarchy in the components. So generally, the curriculum will dictate the standards that are covered by the other 3 components. So it is recommended to start with the curriculum component if that's possible, and then kind of work your way through it: curriculum, teaching and learning materials, teacher training, and then assessment. However, like I said, it is a very flexible process and can be done however is best for the country and kind of their situation and needs. All right. So next, I want to kind of quickly talk about the different benefits of completing the Align process. First and foremost, Align helps countries to kind of identify whether their different pedagogical supports are sufficient to prepare learners to develop minimum proficiency. So is their curriculum, preparing students, their teacher training, preparing teachers to teach that curriculum, etc. And then it also helps to kind of identify any areas of misalignment that might be compromising learner performance. So then kind of once stakeholders have an understanding of those 2 things, they can use that to then improve learner performance by revising and transforming their existing resources like their curriculum and teaching and learning materials, or to revise their support systems like teacher training, or even policies like an education sector plan, or even create new ones from scratch. And then kind of the last benefits of completing the Align process is that Align helps to identify realistic short and medium-term learning targets for reading and math. And the measures also help to reduce learning inequality at a national or global level. So. All right, so now we're going to jump into kind of the steps that it takes to facilitate the Align itself. There are 4 steps, and the first step is to help stakeholders that will be involved in the Align process to understand what the GPF is and the role of the Align process in improving learner performance. So this step can be done in a variety of different ways. You can share the resources with the stakeholders. We have a whole slew of resources that we'll be sharing at the end of the webinar today that can be used to kind of educate different stakeholders about the Align process and GPF. You can also hold meetings with different stakeholders, do training activities, or you can invite stakeholders to attend events like this that we have throughout the year. Once you kind of have that kind of capacity built, then you can jump into step 2. And step 2 is basically the planning phase of the process. So you work with stakeholders to kind of identify the components and subcomponents that will be the focus of the Align process. And then you also identify the different types of data you'll need to collect when you're reviewing those components and the different resources that you'll be looking at. So for example, you may decide to do a teacher training Align, and then subcomponents you would think about, are you going to focus on pre-service or in-service training, and then what resources do you need to look at? Do you need to look at like a syllabus or actual training materials? So all of that kind of happens during this step. After that, the third step is to actually facilitate the Align process itself. And this is kind of the phase where you're collecting data and doing a review of the materials. This can be like a desk review completed by a group of individuals. It can be done through a series of working meetings, or it can also be done in a workshop setting. And we're currently creating some of the different resources that can be used for this specific step, and those will be available later in the year. But I just wanted to go ahead and mention that we are working on that. So once again, this is kind of the step where they're actually doing the Align process and conducting the review of each of the different components. And then the last step is step 4, where we basically just ask stakeholders to present the findings of the Align process with relevant decision makers, maybe from the Ministry of Education or donors or from implementing partners. And the purpose of that is basically, obviously, to share the findings, but also to gain buy-in for the follow-up steps. So once again, Align is just a diagnostic tool to say, hey, this is how closely, all these education inputs align to global norms or global proficiencies. However, now that we've found all of these gaps, what are the steps we're going to do to address the gaps? So it's important to get buy-in at this step for those follow-up steps. And follow-up steps could be anything ranging from revisions to advocacy to maybe rolling out a whole new curriculum, training new teachers, etc. All right, so when you are working on planning an Align process, there are several different parameters to consider for what your Align will look like and its design. So the first thing is to look at the breadth of the Align. So that's essentially choosing which components you're going to focus on and maybe which subcomponents as well. So for example, you might choose to do the teacher training component, and the subcomponent would be you're going to focus on pre-service training. From there, it's good to think about the target population. So are you going to be working in the formal or basic education system, or maybe the non-formal education system? Then think about kind of targeted subpopulations, maybe out-of-school children or children with disabilities, or maybe even specific programming, like maybe there's an early grade reading program or an accelerated education learning program that you're going to focus on. Next, you need to consider the type of leadership model that you want the Align process to kind of fall under. And your options are basically a centralized version where you maybe have one person at the Ministry of Education who's kind of coordinating and overseeing the whole process. Or you could also do a more decentralized version where you maybe have several different stakeholders responsible for different components or subcomponents of the Align process. And then the last thing to think about is timing. So you can do the Align process all at once where you're focusing on all 4 components, or you might want to do it more asynchronous and do it kind of like more ad hoc and one component at a time. A lot of countries might only have the resources or time to focus on one component, and they don't know when the next component will get to, be a priority. So that's another option. It's a very flexible process. So we just want to make sure that that's clear. You don't have to do the full Align. You can just kind of pick and choose based on your country's needs. Great. So next, we'll talk about the readiness requirements for the Align. So this is kind of what does a country kind of need to have in place in order for them to be prepared to facilitate the Align. So the first and foremost, the most important thing that you need is political will and buy-in from the right decision makers and stakeholders. And to really get this buy-in, decision makers need to identify kind of, they need to have this like burning need to identify why learners are underperforming. Maybe they're not happy with the results that the country or state are getting on the national or subnational or international assessments. And then they also kind of need to, want to identify what changes need to be made to maximize learner performance. And then, once decision makers kind of have that level of interest, that will create political appetite to actually carry out the Align process and the appetite to follow through on all of the recommendations identified through the Align process. And then kind of after that, we just need decision makers to be willing to take ownership of the process. So they need to help identify resources for the process, identify time to make it happen, and then also just kind of be there to follow up with it and make sure it happens. Okay, so now we're going to jump into the different inputs that are required to apply the Align process, and we're going to start by talking about the time it takes for Align. Now, just in general, the inputs are very dependent on the parameters that you select for the Align process. So in terms of time, the Align could take anywhere from 1 week to 3 months per component. So that's not all 4 components, that's just for one component. And it just depends on which component you choose as to how long that component takes. So for example, in Nigeria, they did an Align for the assessment component, and they did that through a 1-week workshop, and they were able to kind of create all the assessment standards that they needed within that 1 week. However, if you do a textbook component, that is going to take a lot, teaching and learning materials Align, that's going to take a lot longer because it takes longer to review textbooks and all the associated materials. And that could take up to 3 months. And then something to keep in mind is that all of the follow-up steps are going to require even more time. So the follow-up steps are not part of the Align process itself. The Align process itself is just a diagnostic tool that's relatively quick and easy, but the follow-up steps are where a lot of time and resources come into place. So the Align process follow-up steps may include any of the different activities that are needed to update, finalize, and disseminate each component after the Align review. So these kind of follow-up processes could take several months or years depending on the number of revisions needed. So it just depends on kind of what the focus of the Align is as to how long it takes. But stakeholders that are jumping into the Align process need to be aware of that before they commit to using the tool. Next, really briefly want to talk about the leadership and expertise needed for Align. So first, you need to have kind of one person that's responsible for coordinating the Align process. And then apart from that, it's very important to have experts involved that have a really strong technical background in reading or math, depending on which topic you're focusing on. We've heard feedback that, just having education generalists participate is not as effective as having people in the room that specialize specifically on reading or math instruction. So that is very important. And then also you need to have other experts participate who are relevant to the different parameters of the Align that are selected. So if you focus on teacher training, for instance, you need to make sure you have teacher training experts in the room as well. Outside of that, obviously we want to prioritize having local leadership and expertise. And then if needed, it's okay to bring in international experts as well. And we recommend potentially bringing in people who are familiar with the GPF, with MEL or reading and numeracy instruction. And lastly, we'll talk about budget. So the Align is relatively cost effective and inexpensive. The expenses related to the Align process could potentially include workshop facilitation and hosting expenses, per diem and travel for workshop attendance, fees and expenses for local or international consultants, and then fees and expenses for any kind of desk review or data collection that needs to take place. All right, and the last part of this first part of the presentation is just a quick overview of the Align guidance document. So this document was basically created to kind of provide the framework for what the Align process should look like. And it provides advice on how to prepare for the Align process and how to lead inquiry across the different 4 pedagogical components. So there are a couple of things that the Align guidance really emphasizes that I want to kind of communicate here. First, the GPF is a reference and a guide. It's not meant to be prescriptive. So we don't recommend for a country to kind of copy paste the Align into their national curriculum. We instead advise that countries kind of make decisions about the different standards that they include in their curriculum based on what's appropriate for their context, their local culture, their needs, their students' abilities. And also because the GPF was designed to be very general, so it could be applied globally. It doesn't have like language specific skills that need to be taught in different countries. So we just want to make sure that that's clear. The GPF is used as a reference guide. It's not meant to be prescriptive for this process. We also want to make it clear that the Align process has boundaries, partly due to the content of the GPF. So I kind of mentioned this just now, but the reading skills or the reading standards in the GPF not include pre-literacy skills or language-specific skills that countries need to include in their curriculum. The next thing we want to talk about is that the process may need to be complete or complemented with other forms of inquiry or data collection, because there are other factors that impact student learning outside of just what's included in the curriculum, the TLM, and the teacher training and assessments. You might need to look at the student's learning environment or the policies that are in place. There's so many different things that impact student learning. So we want to make it clear that this is not, this assessment or this kind of review process doesn't cover every factor that impacts student learning. And then the last thing is that the whole purpose of this process is that it's going to launch a lot of important discussions that are helpful for stakeholders to have about what should be included in their national standards and what should not be included, how standards should be paced and how they should be leveled, and then also kind of what the different follow-up steps should be for the Align process. So that is all to be expected. All right, so that concludes the first part of the presentation. And now I'm going to hand over to Nathalie Louge from FHI 360, who will give us an overview of the case study of Align in Djibouti.
Great, thanks. So thanks very much for that, Kathleen, and for that overview of the Align process. Well, as Kathleen mentioned, I will be presenting on the case study of Djibouti. We have a program there called DEGRA, or the Djibouti Early Grade Reading Activity. And so I want to first speak about the initial context of Djibouti, or I would say the pre-Align context relative to each of the components of Align. So when DEGRA first began working with the Ministry of Education, or the MENFOP, back in 2019, they were already in the early stages of reviewing their curriculum. So there was already kind of some inkling that there were some issues with their curriculum and that they would like to make it better. So this included the French curriculum, in which reading, language, and writing were incorporated. And I should note that French is the language of instruction in Djibouti from grade 1 onwards, and even though it's not a mother tongue. And they knew that this would impact also the teaching and learning materials. So essentially, they looked at the curriculum and then they were ready to revise the teaching and learning materials that were attached to them. In terms of teacher training at the time, they understood that the revisions to the teaching and learning materials and curriculum would also require retraining of in-service teachers, but there was not a plan to align or review the pre-service teacher training curriculum at that time. And finally, in terms of assessment, the MENFOP had existing tools that they were administering on a yearly basis. One of them was called the OTI, but these assessments did not align really with the old curriculum or with the teaching and learning materials. And so with this in mind, DEGRA worked collaboratively with the MENFOP over the period of 4 years through an iterative process to align these components to one another using the GPF as a framework. Next slide, please. And so what did this look like in practice? And so first, it's important to note that the time frame that Kathleen mentioned earlier, saying it would take weeks to months. So the reason why it took forever is because the GPF underwent a lot of revisions between 2019 and the present day. And so as a result, we were constantly looking to adapt and make sure that we were continuously aligning, let's say, to this ever-evolving document. And so this iterative methodology, I guess, was applied, and that's why it took so long. But we would think that if the GPF had already been an existing tool, that Align would have taken a shorter amount of time, with the subsequent steps taking the time it would need to take to be able to adapt the curriculum, TLMs, teacher training, etc. And so in late 2019, an initial draft of the GPF was released for pilot, and Djibouti's MENFOP volunteered to map the GPF against their own curriculum and assessments to determine where items or skills were aligned or not. The MENFOP team made recommendations to make the GPF more user-friendly. After this workshop, the MENFOP leveraged this first draft of the GPF to align to their grade 1 to 5 reading curriculum standards, so they could be used to develop their new TLMs and associated teacher training, which would then be developed and then piloted and then revised over the course of the program. And so basically they understood that because it was a pilot document, that they were going to continue to revise the TLMs and the curriculum to align to the ever-evolving GPF skills, again, not completely prescribing and just taking those and then treating them as a curriculum, but making sure that they were integrated and that they were accounted for in the decisions made about what to include and what not to include in their curriculum and TLMs. And then also to continue making decisions about how to integrate teacher and student feedback to improve the TLMs as well. And so as the project piloted the new TLMs, the MENFOP asked if the project could also assist in aligning the pre-service training to the in-service training on early grade reading and on language to the GPF. And so that is something that we did undertake as well and supported the MENFOP in. And finally, in terms of the assessment, prior to the GPF, the DEGRA project had worked with the MENFOP to adapt the grade 2 and grade 5 EGRA to Djibouti, as it was part of our contract. But then when the GPF was released and the policy linking methodology was released with its associated criteria and standards for global reporting, the MENFOP asked the project to help them again realign grade 2 and 5, the grade 2 and 5 EGRAs, so that they would appropriately, or I guess strongly align to the GPF for the purpose of setting benchmarks for global reporting using the policy linking methodology that Kathleen described earlier. And this was done in 2021 for grade 2 and 2022 for grade 5. Next slide, please. And so how did this case align with the align process? So in short, as you can see, it didn't really follow it linearly. And so because of this, it was quite an iterative process, as we say. So due to the GPF and the policy linking pilot process. So there was a lot of back and forth, but it did eventually lead to an alignment of all 4 components, which is great. And one may ask how the MENFOP didn't lose patience with this constant back and forth and revisions. And truly, this ministry is incredible. But the most significant factor in obtaining this result was the MENFOP's buy-in and full understanding that the GPF was of huge value and that it was a framework undergoing pilot. And their patience and enthusiasm throughout the process resulted in Djibouti now having a primary education system that has a curriculum, TLMs, teacher training, both in service and pre-service, and assessments that are aligned to the GPF and therefore to one another. And so ultimately, in the end, we have a fully aligned system in Djibouti, thanks to this process. Thanks very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Nathalie. We have a variety of new resources and tools that we have been working to create with you and share with you. Kathleen Denny is going to jump back in and help walk you through each of these tools. Back to you, Kathleen.
Thanks, Carrie and Nathalie. So as I mentioned earlier today, we just launched the new Align Help Desk today, and it's now live on EduLinks, and Haley just popped the link into the chat. So the Help Desk has all sorts of resources to help guide you in your work with the Align process. There are several different tabs of information. You can look on there to kind of get a quick overview of what the Align process is. We also have several case studies available on the help desk, including the case study that Nathalie just provided on Djibouti. We also have examples from Uzbekistan and Nigeria that you can look through for more inspiration kind of how Align can be used and the different ways it can be envisioned. We also have a full list of tools and resources that you can look through. There are links to related materials like policy linking and the GPF as well. So that's kind of a one-stop shop for everything that is Align related. We also have an FAQs page where you can look at kind of answers to frequently asked questions about Align. So instead of kind of digging through the resources, there are a lot of answers that you can find there. Then we have the actual help desk feature, which is where you can go to contact me or another Align specialist, and we will answer any questions that you have and also be able to respond to requests for support. We are available to help with kind of the initial planning stages of the Align process, and we can kind of give you feedback on your different ideas. And we are also available for technical assistance calls, so we can jump in and support you as needed. We do want to make it clear, though, that we do not have funding available for this type of support. It's mostly just advice and material review and feedback in that manner. we have a section of the page where you can express interest in facilitating Align. So at that on that form, you can kind of give us an overview of what your plans are and just let us know where you're going to be working and kind of the components that you're going to be focused on. And this will help us kind of know what's going on where and where our support is needed. And then we also have a feedback form where you can let us know about your experiences conducting Align. We're always looking to improve the materials that we're creating, so this process just helps us with that. So that's everything on the help desk. And then I wanted to highlight 2 new tools that are available. The first one is the new Align readiness checklist. And this tool can be used to kind of determine a country's readiness to conduct Align. So this process is a 4-step process where you kind of think about the stakeholders' interest in conducting Align, evaluate stakeholders' goals and motivation in conducting Align, stakeholders' ability to carry out the Align process, and then also stakeholders' willingness and ability to follow through on all of the action steps identified by the Align process. So that is available on the help desk now. And then we also have one more thing we wanted to highlight, and it is on the next slide, and it is the new Align planning guide. So this guide can be used to help plan the Align process step by step. It starts with defining the parameters of the Align process. Then it helps you to identify the different resources that you'll need for the Align in terms of the timing, the experts that you need in the room, and the money that you'll need to support the process. And then there's also a section for you to create a work plan for Align. So basically it's a document that helps you think through all the different decisions that you need to make and kind of get your plans on paper. And then you can share that obviously with any relevant stakeholders, or you can also share it to us for feedback if you want kind of advice on how to move forward with your Align. And then we also recommend using the case studies from Djibouti, Uzbekistan, and Nigeria as examples when you're completing that planning guide, just for inspiration or ideas. Okay, next slide. All right, and we had I wanted to set aside a little bit of time to talk about some updates to related resources. So Melissa Chiappetta from USAID is going to jump in now really quickly and give us an update on the new policy linking materials.
Great, thanks, Kathleen. So just wanted to give you a little bit of an update. As Kathleen mentioned, the policy linking toolkit has been updated. So we are now on the version 3.0, and you can find the toolkit. Thanks, Haley just posted it for us. So perfect. You can find the toolkit there in the chat and at that link. And essentially the updates cover reporting. So one of the big changes is there was an alignment between the Global Proficiency Framework and the minimum proficiency levels. There's a lot of technical detail that goes into this, but essentially the minimum proficiency levels are a UNESCO Institute for Statistics set of levels that they use to create the Sustainable Development Goals. And so once the GPF and the minimum proficiency levels were aligned, there was a decision that policy linking really aligned best for reporting on SDG 4.1.1 A, B, and C at grades 2, 5, and 8, respectively. So in the past, you may remember, if you're familiar with the toolkit, that reporting for SDGs could have happened for grades 2 and 3 for A, or across end of primary, which could be grades 4 through 6 for B, and then across early secondary, which could be anywhere between grades 8 and 9 generally. But now the reporting is for grades 2, 5, and 8. So that means that you can still use the other grades in a country if you're interested. So if you go through an align process and you're aligning at grade 3, you can still conduct a policy linking workshop for grade 3, but you wouldn't necessarily use those results to report to SDG 4.1.1. There is a way that you could also link the grade 3 results to grade 2 outcomes and then report those to SDG 4.1.1. So if you have any questions about that, happy to answer them. Other other updates to the toolkit were really just to clean up various aspects, to change a little bit of the alignment criteria required between an existing assessment in a country and the Global Proficiency Framework. So now there are a minimum number of items that need to be included in an assessment for it to effectively align. And those details are all in the toolkit as well. And then just the process. So it used to be a 7-step process, and now it is a 6-step process. And previously there was an external entity that would review results from the assessment to see if they were valid, and then also results from the policy linking workshop to check the validity and reliability of those results. That is now all an internal process. So if you're facilitating a policy linking workshop, or a country that you're working with is facilitating one, they would go through that process themselves, and there are tools in the toolkit that help you to do that. So those are kind of the big changes that exist in the toolkit. There are some other small ones. Definitely happy to answer questions. And for those of you who are new to policy linking, hopefully this wasn't too much detail, but definitely happy to go into more. And also wanted to share that we do have a policy linking and global proficiency community of practice that also discusses Align and other tools. And so I will share the link if you're interested in joining that community of practice and learning more about any of these tools. You can sign up. It's available and open to anyone. So please feel free to share with your networks as well. And the link there is the list to sign up. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Melissa. And now we can jump into our Q&A. So at this time, if you have any questions, we can go ahead and answer those. We've gotten a few questions in the chat, so we'll go ahead and address those. And then we can also take them from the audience live. Okay, so the first question is, do you have any indication that the Align process helps streamline learning expectations all the way down to the classroom level so teachers better understand the expectations for their learners? Nathalie, you went ahead and answered this. Do you want to go ahead and share what you said?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I typed it in the chat. Sorry, I'm having a hard time looking at finding the question. Yeah, I guess insofar as the curriculum objectives are clearly communicated, let's say, in the TLMs and the teacher trainings. I mean, I guess basically you just want to make sure that the whole point is to kind of use the GPF as a reference point, so that everything aligns and you're testing kids on what they're being taught, and that teachers understand how to teach to the curriculum, etc. Yeah. And surprisingly, that actually is not the case in many contexts we work in sometimes.
Great. Another person asked, to what extent are different components of Align correlated? And I would say that there is, obviously you're kind of looking at the standards across the board, and how the standards are kind of first taught in the curriculum, and then how they're represented in teaching and learning materials, how teachers are trained to teach the standards, and then how the standards are assessed in the assessment itself. So I'd say that that's kind of the common thread across all of the different components, but obviously there's a lot of different things that you need to consider when looking at those standards and how they're communicated in each of the component. But there is a lot of overlap, and as I mentioned earlier, the kind of curriculum component does largely dictate the other components. So that is something to think about when kind of creating your Align process. Another question is, does modular implementation miss out from the advantages of holistic implementation? I would say that it is a little, I'd say that just based on the case studies we've looked at, the countries that have been able to kind of do all 4 components, it seems to have been a more streamlined process, and it seems to have, you know, like all of the decision making kind of is able to flow easily from one component to the next, and we're able to kind of keep track of that versus in Nigeria, for instance, they only focused on one component. They did the assessment component, so there it will be a little bit more ad hoc to address the other component, so it might not be quite as streamlined of a process. So I would say that there are advantages and disadvantages to doing all 4 components at once. But I think it does help if everything is recorded. If it's not going to be all at once, then it needs to be all the decisions need to be recorded and documented so they can be passed on to whoever picks up components down the road. All right, other questions? Yes. Okay. Which would you, okay. Does coaching and mentoring fall under teacher training? Yes, it does in terms of the different kind of subcomponents that the guidance recommends examining, that is mentioned. Basically kind of the thing that you would think about when looking at coaching and mentoring is how do those 2 activities support teachers to really master the minimum proficiencies, master teaching the minimum proficiencies to learners. If policy linking is now aligned at grades 2, 5, and 8, should materials, teacher training, and TLMs also be aligned at those levels?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. Essentially, the answer is yes, for reporting purposes. And so I think the question is the purpose of conducting the align and the policy linking, right? So if you're conducting an align workshop or a policy linking workshop to try to get to the point of linking results to SDG 4.1.1 or other global standards, then yes, I would focus on grades 2, 5, and 8. But if you're really using it to identify what's working well in your system and what's not, and where interventions are needed, then I would look at the other grades, whichever grade is of interest to the country. You could accomplish both at the same time, as I said, so that you could look at running a workshop that both does policy linking for grades 2 and 3 as an example. So you could link grade 2 and grade 3 to GPF grade 2. And then also link grade 3 to GPF grade 3 so that you can see the progress that the country is making. But for reporting purposes, you could use grade 2.
Great. And Suzanne asked, are you aware of any similar processes for aligning everything at the ECD level? Nathalie, do you want to share what you shared?
Sure. There's the ECE accelerator. I'm not sure if others on the call have other ideas. I can do some digging for you, Suzanne, if you want. But this was something that that's recently published, I guess, that has been undergoing a lot of pilot and contributions from the global community of practice relative to ECE. But I wouldn't say that it has a GPF attached to it. It's more how to guide countries to implement and roll out ECE. I don't think that there's something like a GPF for preschool unless I am missing something. And Melissa may have another idea.
Thanks, Nathalie. Yeah, I was just going to mention that this has come up quite a bit around the idea of creating a GPF for preschool or early primary, pre-primary. But the challenge is that it's really developmentally, it depends on where kids are developmentally in preschool, right? And so in considering this, a lot of the experts that we spoke with were concerned about the fact that kids develop at different stages in those early years. And so setting standards that would apply across all students of a particular age would not necessarily make a lot of sense, and grades aren't quite the same in pre-primary. So that's the concern that has come up. Definitely, I think there's been interest, and so it's worth looking into what some of the other potential options could be. I will say there are other alignment tools that you can look at that you might use for pre-primary as well. There's one that's called what is it? Surveys for Enacted Curriculum. And it is a tool that allows you to kind of align across your system based on the standards that exist within your system already. So without looking at sort of an external set of standards like the GPF, but taking standards that might exist within a specific context. So a couple of ideas that might help if you're looking to work in pre-primary.
Great, and I think that also highlights something that's important to know is that when you're using the aligned process, we do recommend using the GPF as the primary resource, but we're not limiting the aligned process to just the GPF. Countries can use other resources as relevant. So these different materials that Melissa and Natalie just mentioned would be great to bring into the process, and then also if a country wants to look at an exemplar curriculum from another country, that's also welcome. Or if they want to bring in research, that's great too. So we have an example from the Uzbekistan case study where the Uzbekistan curriculum was actually more advanced than the GPF in a lot of ways, and they were really interested in aligning their education system with the curriculum from South Korea. And so their aligned process heavily relied on the South Korean national curriculum. And they did use the GPF, but more for pacing, more for making sure that they included all of the competencies in their curriculum as opposed to looking at it for pacing. So I just wanted to highlight that really quickly and make sure that that was clear. And I also noticed that Corey was asking if all the resources are if there's a place where all the resources are in the same place. And I'd say the help desk is kind of where we're intending to put everything. So everything that's related to the align process, whether it's the GPF or policy linking or any accompanying training materials for those processes or align, we're hoping to have them all there. If there's anything that you see that's not kind of posted on the align help desk that you think would be relevant, you can always give us feedback and let us know. It would be helpful to post there, and we'd be happy to add those to the page. So I think that we've answered all of the questions.
Great, thank you all so much. Now, if you're interested in joining the Global Reading Network and attending other events or gathering other resources that we have, there are a few ways that you can engage with us. First is that you can become a member by joining our listserv. You can join our LinkedIn groups, which are linked there at the bottom of the page. And you can keep an eye out for our next networking session, which is actually going to be held next week on July 18th. So you can come and attend and network with people who are members of the Global Reading Network. Thank you so much for joining our event today. We're happy to have had the chance to share more about the Align and the tools and resources that we've created. We look forward to seeing how Align continues to be used around the world and supporting your work in various ways. Please keep in touch with us and reach out through the help desk to let us know how your Align plans and to let us know if you have any additional questions. Thank you so much for joining us today.